this is Hamza again from GamingonLinux.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about Interplanetary. So Interplanetary is a turn-based artillery strategy game developed by Team Jolly Roger, and disclosure, I did receive a game key from the developers back when this game was in early access phase, so now I'm covered for that. So Interplanetary is it's a game about waging a war on basically an interplanetary scale. You live along with some opponents in a solar system, and for some reason you want to knock the other players out, and you do this by bombarding their planets with various kinds of weapons such as railguns, missiles, lasers, and even asteroids. And naturally the opponents will try to do the same to you. In order to do this, you need to build various kinds of structures and create mines to produce resources and some, for example, solar power plants to produce electricity to maintain those buildings. And other planets have limited resources, so they will eventually start to run out, so you need to plan for that. But once you have some basic resources, you can start building these various kinds of weapons such as railguns, missiles and lasers. Of course you need to unlock them. The game has a tech tree that is full of stuff to research, and some of them will unlock buildings, some will grant you access to various kinds of upgrades that will also prove handy because they will allow you to kill your enemies or produce resources a little bit more efficiently. So you need to, when you do that, you can get to like building these various kinds of weapons that you will then hurl at the enemies. The combat is, like I mentioned, it's artillery strategy. So you might be familiar with some of these kinds of games where you usually have an artillery piece or a tank or something, and then you fire at your enemies in a turn-based style. This is sort of similar, except of course because this is interplanetary and not just planetary, you actually need to take into account the orbital mechanics. So you can, for example, curve your missiles in a way that you can, for example, fire behind a sun or behind a planet. And of course also the way you placed your artillery also matters quite a lot, because for example, you might not get the best firing arc if the gun is on the exact opposite side of the planet when the target you're trying to hit is on the other side. And if you use something like lasers, you need direct line of sight to actually be able to target the enemy planets. But of course, if you use something like a railgun, then you just need to get the weapon pointed in the more or less the correct way, so you can get it to hit the planets. This can be a little bit tricky, and at first I kind of struggled with it, but you will get used to the orbital mechanics quite quickly, and you will start hitting the enemies quite nicely. Of course, it's not just about hitting the enemy, it's also about protecting your own planet from enemies, because the enemies will definitely try to fight back. And to do this, you need to protect your buildings with either shield generators or kinetic defense systems. The shield generators are a little bit more advanced, and they will protect your cities and buildings against laser attacks and I believe missiles. But the kinetic defense systems, on the other hand, are a little bit cheaper, but they will only protect you against actual like kinetic objects such as missiles and railgun fragments. So you will want to definitely place those in various kinds of places to protect your own buildings, because otherwise they are going to get blown up, and that's no fun, because that means you will have to rebuild them, and that takes up resources, and like I said, you're on the clock in this game. Eventually your planet will completely dry out, and then the only resources you have are the stuff that you have in your storage. If that runs out, then you are on your own, because you might still get electricity, because you can have those solar power plants that don't use actual like resources to produce electricity. All your nuclear power plants will definitely stop working, but you will still have some electricity. So as long as you have electricity and some buildings left, you can still play the game. But you cannot repair your buildings, you cannot upgrade them, and you certainly cannot build new buildings. So everything will start to collapse when that happens. There is also an intelligence system, which this plays a quite important role. So at first you don't actually see anything on the opponent planet, so you cannot see a single building. It's all hidden. And in order to see it, you need telescope arrays that will scan the planetary surface, and if you have enough of these telescopes, you can actually start to see the enemy buildings. But there is also a counterintelligence system, so if you build these data security hubs, it will produce counterintelligence, which will, if the amount of counterintelligence is higher than the amount of intelligence, it will actually hide the buildings from your enemies, or from you, if depending on who is actually doing the counterintelligence. So it's not all about building huge amounts of weapons, because that might not actually work. If you use something like the railguns, which are super inaccurate, but the railgun ammo actually it fragments in the atmosphere, so it sort of spreads out into a wider area and thus causes more damage. Then in that case you might not need as much intelligence, but you cannot do concentrated attacks against cities, for example, which is what you need to do. When you destroy all the enemy cities, you win, and when your cities get destroyed, you lose. It's very simple. So your cities are your main, like, they are the victory points. Destroying them is very, very, very good or very, very bad, depending on who is actually doing the destroying. But intelligence is there to sort of cover you as long as you need, and the intelligence level also determines what buildings you actually will see. So some buildings that are less like stealthy, such as very big buildings like the asteroid diversion systems and these intelligence systems themselves, the data security hubs and telescope arrays, they will show up quicker. The cities are, as far as I know, they are the most stealthy buildings, so you will need very high intelligence to actually see them. But that's basically how the intelligence system works. It can very much break your game if you don't focus on intelligence enough, because the enemies will definitely see exactly where you have your important buildings, and they will try to disrupt your energy production, your mines, and all of that stuff. So you will definitely want to keep them very much hidden from the enemy. The game it's pretty deep. It's not like too complex. It might seem a little bit complex at first, but it definitely isn't quite as complex as it may at first seem. But there are definitely some gameplay elements that you will need to take some time to master them properly. But it's relatively simple, and you will probably get the hang of this game in a matter of, like, I'd say maybe 30 minutes, and you will pretty much know what you need to do. There is a pretty extensive text tutorial that you will probably want to read before you actually go into the game. There isn't like a guided tutorial, so you will need to do the reading up on your own. But the tutorial is, like I said, it's quite extensive. It covers everything the game has to offer, and it does the job fairly nicely. Each match takes, I'd say, about 2 hours or less. It depends on the difficulty and the number of opponents you have. So if you do like a 1 versus 1 duel, it will definitely take a quite a lot shorter time, because it will definitely take a lot less time to destroy cities on one planet, because that means destroying I think it's like 3 or 4 cities, and then the one side wins. But when you have multiple, you definitely it will start to take like a longer time to destroy all these cities. But it doesn't take too long to actually complete a match. So you will probably play through one match on one sitting or something like that. You can still save the game if you want to, and naturally there are 2 gameplay options. You can either play online against other players. There is currently no way to play online with some players and some AI, as far as I know. That's still on, like, they are still trying to do that, but it's not there quite yet. Or you can play local games. It's either hot seat, which is pretty good, or you can play against the AI with, I believe, 3 difficulty settings. Normal was pretty good. The game performs pretty well. it definitely does jog a little bit when you like get to the later phases of the game, where you have a lot of stuff on the planets. This is of course on the open source Radeon driver, because I'm currently using my R7 370 instead of my 760. But overall it performs very good, and a game like this doesn't really require constant 60 frames per second, but it does run at around 60 FPS most of the time anyway. And the graphics are, well, you don't really need a whole lot of like graphical stuff for a game like this, but for what it's worth, the game actually does look pretty good. The planets look very nice, and they definitely do their job. The UI can at times be a little bit clumsy or cumbersome, but most of the time the UI works very well, and I don't really have anything to complain about in this department. And then about drivers, so at the moment it works pretty much like flawlessly on Nvidia, as you might imagine. On AMD side, it's not quite as perfect. Catalyst doesn't seem to be working with this game, but if you use the open source drivers for AMD graphics cards, it seems to be working just fine. So if you have some trouble playing the game on Catalyst drivers, then you can just switch over to the open source drivers, and I think it pretty much just works there. I've been just playing it mainly on the open source driver, and I haven't had any issues with the game. So that's about it. It's a nice game, and I do think it's probably worth taking a look at. It might not be for everyone, and it's to some people it might be a little bit pricey at 15 euros, but I personally will give this a recommendation. I do plan on playing this a little bit more. Currently I've played it about 6 hours, and there is definitely a lot more to do in that game, especially if I get a little bit more human players to play with me, well, against me anyway. But overall, I do give this game my recommendations. It's a nice game. It's quite unique in what it does. It doesn't try to do something that has been done like a lot of times. It tries to do its own little thing, and the artillery mechanic along with like planet building is, I'd say it's pretty much unique, and it's interesting. So that's that for Interplanetary. Hope you have enjoyed the video, and we will see in future videos.